Congratulations to Marine Le Pen. The Front National have again defied the odds and taken a candidate to the runoffs in the presidential election, taking an impressive 21.3% of the vote. Over 1 in 5 in France are now voting Front National, which is good news in my book. But sadly, it's not great news, because Marine Le Pen came second. Now, I don't want to put a dampener on things, but she was beaten by the pro-EU Emmanuel Macron, who took 24.1% of the vote. Now, all this just makes me shake my head in despair. What needs to happen in France to wake people up? I think it would be fair to say that France has probably taken the worst of the Islamic terrorism that has occurred in Europe over the last few years. Now, that's not to say other countries have had it easy. Oh no, but France has seen probably the largest number of terrorist attacks, the highest body count, and also arguably the most gruesome and disturbing of these attacks. Who could forget the attacks in November 2015 in Paris, where Muslim extremists killed 130 people, including 89 at the Bataclan Theatre? Another 368 people were injured, and of those 368, almost 100 were classed as seriously injured. That's almost 500 people either killed or injured in a single terrorist attack. And I've seen the pictures from the Bataclan Theatre. The floor was literally covered in blood. It was like something out of a horror film. This attack alone should have been enough to convince the people of France that something was very wrong with their multicultural, pro-immigration establishment. But the November 2015 terrorist attacks were not the first. Earlier that year, Muslim terrorists had attacked the offices of the Charlie Hebdo magazine, killing 12 and injuring 11. Now, there was a certain irony to this though, as Charlie Hebdo is a far-left, anti-racist and atheist publication that has repeatedly tried to undermine the fabric of French society with its satirical drawings and articles. The editorial team at Charlie Hebdo had also prided themselves of their condemnation of the Front National and anti-immigrant sentiment. However, on January the 7th, 2015, those at Charlie Hebdo learned the hard way that whilst criticising and mocking Christianity is one thing, extending freedom of speech and satire to include the criticism of Islam is another thing altogether. The tolerant multicultural utopia that Charlie Hebdo was so proud of came crashing in around them with the sound of gunfire. Rather ironic, really, and a chilling reminder of how these multicultural utopias end up. All those facile multi-faith ceremonies for the cameras, all those, in inverted commas, moderate Muslims who are wheeled out for the press conferences, and all the talk of diversity being France's greatest strength wasn't much good when the bullets started flying. And since then, we've seen more of these attacks. Of course, there was the horrific Bastille Day attack. On the evening of the 14th of July 2016, a 19-ton cargo truck was deliberately driven into crowds celebrating Bastille Day on the Promenade d'Anglais in Nice, resulting in the deaths of 86 people and the injuring of 434. Again, a huge body count. And although less people died than in the November 2015 attacks, the actual total of those killed and injured was greater, totaling 520 people. And I believe there is a certain sick irony in the date the attacker chose, as Bastille Day is when the French commemorate the storming of the Bastille on the 14th of July 1789, a turning point in the French Revolution, where the people of France won their freedom. And just look at how that freedom is being given away so gleefully by the traitor politicians in the French establishment. But France hasn't just seen huge numbers of attacks, or attacks that have slain and injured huge numbers of people. France has also endured one of the most gruesome attacks seen across Europe, where an 84-year-old priest had his throat cut at the altar of his church, again by Muslim extremists. This cowardly and spine-chilling act must go down as one of the single most gruesome terrorist attacks to have taken place in Europe. The personal nature and the barbarity of this attack are shocking. What's more, the fact the victim was an elderly Catholic priest and the attack took place at an altar says it all, really. But it isn't just Islamic terrorism that's dogging France. Paris has been besieged by rioting over the last few years, most of which doesn't even get reported outside of France, as the establishment and the media simply hates covering their multicultural failures. Adding to this are the pictures coming out of Paris that show that it has become nothing more than a filthy slum, with immigrants camping out and turning streets into shanty towns. A once beautiful city that was a centre of European culture and heritage has now been turned into a third world hellhole. Yet despite all this, despite the terrorism, despite cities being overrun with immigrants, despite rioting, attacks on whites and creeping Sharia law, here we are with Marine Le Pen coming second. And don't get me wrong, I'm over the moon that she's achieved this, building on her father's work in such a positive way. And we must all remember, Jean-Marie Le Pen took second place in 2002, but with a lesser vote, 16.98%, 4% less than Marine Le Pen took this year. I'm still happy that Marine Le Pen is through to the last round. I'm still happy that she took 1 in 5 votes, and I'm happy people are waking up. But the fact is, we need more, and we need it quickly. And sometimes I do feel a sense of despair. I actually wonder, what will it take to wake up more Europeans to the crisis in our midst that is growing so rapidly? And the other reason I despair is time is not on our side. We do not have the luxury of decades to build a resistance. I couldn't actually find the figures for France, but I know that 33% of primary school children in England are non-white. I know that 40% of primary school children in Germany are non-white. That means in 15 years, 33% of 20-year-olds living in England and 40% of 20-year-olds living in Germany will not be European. They won't be white. And I shudder to think what the makeup of primary schools will be like then. As I said, I couldn't find the actual figures for primary schools in France, but I can imagine that they are very similar to Germany and England, and maybe even slightly worse. And that assertion is backed up by the figures that I did find. These figures stated that the number of non-white births in France is already 34.44%. And that frightening data was taken 5 years ago in 2012, and things certainly haven't got any better since then. But as this sweeping demographic change takes place, it means that the road to electoral success gets more and more difficult. It means that as we are slowly outbred, we will see the chances of a peaceful resolution to this multicultural nightmare get slimmer and slimmer. And believe me, I'm not advocating violence, but I can assure you of this: the grim reality of such demographic change will ensure that Europe does become an increasingly violent place. Terrorism, rioting, and attacks on whites will increase. So bearing all this in mind, this may be France's last chance to actually make a change, to actually turn the tide. Because within the next 50 years, France, just like Britain, won't even be a majority white country. And I don't know the date for France, but I do know that Britain will be majority non-white by 2060. And we've already seen London go this way. And look how that has turned out. Our capital city now has a Muslim mayor that tells us that terrorism is part and parcel of daily life. And believe me, when whites are a minority in France, there will be no special protections, no special status, and no establishment help for the white minority. In fact, in 2010, a rapper and sociologist joined forces to publish a book and CD, both entitled F***K France, a group called the General Alliance Against Racism and for the Respect of French and Christian Identity, took them to criminal court in Paris and charged them with public insult and incitement to discrimination, hatred, or violence. After 5 years, the court finally came to their verdict. It claimed that white people are not considered native to France under French law, so the two defendants could not be found guilty. The court said that native French as a group does not cover any reality, legally, historically, biologically, or sociologically. It ruled that whites or the white race is in no way a legal component of the quality of the French, and apparently that native white French do not constitute a group of people. So there you have it. Not only are whites being bred out, but they will officially have no protection under the law, no special status, and they won't even be afforded the same rights as all other people on the planet, a homeland. This is so absurd. Imagine telling blacks in Nigeria that they don't constitute the native population and aren't even a verifiable component of the Nigerian people. Not only would this be scorned, and rightly so, but there would be human rights groups from all over the world joining forces to defend the rights of those native to Nigeria. Funds would be raised, high-priced lawyers would donate their time and services for free, and sanctions would likely be raised against those accused of dispossessing the native Nigerians. In fact, it would be such a celebrated cause that one can imagine the queues of talentless so-called celebrities that would be clamouring to lend their face to the appeals. But not when it's whites. When it's white people, the talk of genocide and dispossession is met with mocking smirks and ridicule from some, and jubilant cheers from others. But the saddest thing about all this is the jubilant cheers over Europeans being dispossessed of their own lands and being bred out of existence often comes from white people themselves. No other group on the planet would cheer their own demise. That is the madness that we Europeans have descended into. So here we are, with France on the precipice. The French people are besieged by immigration, terrorism, rioting, and are faced with an unprecedented demographic change. Yet thanks to the Marxist brainwashing, only 1 in 5 can actually bring themselves to vote for real change. And yes, I realise that Marine Le Pen has more votes than any of the old establishment parties in France. I say the old ones because I class Macron as being firmly part of the establishment. I understand the huge achievement that Marine Le Pen has managed to bring about. But the crux of the matter here is I don't actually view any of the other parties as different from one another. In fact, power has repeatedly changed hands in France between these establishment parties, and they have all advanced the globalist multicultural agenda. Yeah, maybe at slightly different speeds, but it has all led to the same place: white displacement and genocide. Every time I see one of the establishment parties replace another as the ruling party, I don't see it as change. I see it as merely passing the baton of globalism from one set of traitors to another. For me, the choice is clear. It's either Marine Le Pen or nothing. It's either the Front National or the establishment, because the Front National, and only the Front National, stands opposed to the multicultural nightmare engulfing France today. And believe me, it's not just myself who is framing this in such a manner. In fact, the French establishment are too. I read this from Vox. Almost everyone in French politics is working to stop Le Pen. Even conservatives have united behind centre-left Macron in an effort to stop the National Front. As soon as polls in France closed Sunday for the first round of voting in the presidential election, a very uniquely French thing had happened. Virtually all of the defeated presidential candidates and other political leaders promptly coalesced around centrist Emmanuel Macron, who faces off against far-right populist Marine Le Pen on May 7. Endorsements came quickly, and they were notably enthusiastic, and yet they were less about Macron as a politician and more about conveying a simple message to the French voting public. Le Pen and her Front National pose an existential threat to the fundamental values of the French state and must be thwarted at all costs. End quote. To me, that says it all. The choice for the French people is clear. You vote for the rotten, corrupt, anti-white, anti-French establishment, or you vote for change. And the establishment have made it very clear that there is only one candidate who will ever bring about real change in France. This could be do or die for the French. And believe me, it's a high-stakes game, as thousands of years of European culture stand to be lost if the cultural Marxists and the globalist establishment get their way. This isn't just an election. It's a war for the survival of the French people. Good luck, Marine Le Pen, because if France ever needed another Joan of Arc, it's now. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this podcast, you can like and share on social networks. Please help spread the message. If you want to hear more from me, please hit the subscribe button, as new videos are posted every week. You can also read my book, The Fall of Western Man. It's available as a free ebook and in both hardback and paperback, and the links are all in the description below. Finally, if you want to join in the discussion with me, feel free to add me on Facebook, or you can follow me on Twitter as well. Everyone's welcome.